In the small town of Willowbrook, nestled against the foothills of the Ozarks, Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears. Her wedding ring caught the dim light as she twisted it anxiously around. Her finger. After 6 years of marriage to Thomas Mitchell, heir to the town's largest cattle ranch, the whispers had grown from concerned murmurs to outright condemnation. Barren, they called her, a failure, unable to fulfill her most fundamental duty as a wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Sarah didn't know as she gazed out at the storm was that fate would soon lead her down a path she never expected, a journey that would reveal shocking truths about her husband's family, uncover a medical reality no doctor had detected, and bring her to the door of a reclusive Comanche healer who would change everything with ancient wisdom the modern world had forgotten. The Mitchell family estate sprawled across 300 acres of prime Oklahoma farmland, a testament to 4 generations of cattle ranching success. The main house, a grand Victorian structure with a wide wraparound porch, stood as the crown jewel of the property. For most of the town's residents, an invitation to the Mitchell home was a coveted honor. For Sarah, it had become a weekly ordeal. Sunday, dinners at the Mitchell estate followed the same ritual. Eleanor Mitchell, Thomas's mother, presided over the dining table with impeccable posture and a critical eye that missed nothing. Her husband, Richard, deferred to her in all matters regarding the family's social standing, which she guarded like a prized heifer. "Thomas tells me the Henderson's daughter just had her 3rd child," Eleanor announced, as she delicately cut into her roast beef. "Their youngest is barely walking. Such a blessing." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she forced herself to maintain her smile. "Yes, I saw Rebecca at the market. The baby is beautiful." Eleanor's gaze fixed on Sarah's empty plate. "You've hardly touched your food. No wonder you're so thin. A woman needs proper nourishment to bear children." Thomas shifted uncomfortably beside Sarah but said nothing. His silence had become as predictable as his mother's barbs. "I'm just not very hungry tonight," Sarah replied quietly. "Well, an empty vessel bears no fruit," Eleanor continued, the biblical allusion hanging heavy in the air. "The Mitchells have always had large families. Richard's grandmother had 7 children. I had 4. It's in our blood." Richard cleared his throat. "Eleanor, perhaps it's just concerning." Eleanor pressed on, "When a family line might end after over a century. Thomas is our only son, after all." Sarah folded her napkin carefully, her knuckles white with tension. 6 years of these dinners, 6 years of monthly disappointments, 6 years of watching the hope in Thomas's eyes gradually dim with each passing month. Later that night, as they drove back to their modest home on the edge of town, Thomas broke their customary silence. "You know my mother means well," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Family is everything to her." Sarah watched the familiar landscape pass by, illuminated briefly by the headlights, before disappearing back into darkness. "And what about you, Thomas? What is everything to you?" The question hung between them, unanswered, as they pulled into their driveway. Their home, a small ranch-style house Thomas had purchased before their wedding, had once felt full of promise. Now the empty bedroom they had painted yellow in anticipation of their first child stood as a monument to their failure. Sarah paused at the door each time she passed, wondering if they should finally convert it to something else, a home office perhaps, or a guest room. But neither of them ever suggested it. At the medical clinic where Sarah worked as a nurse, babies and pregnant women were constant reminders of what she couldn't have. She had learned to steel herself, to smile genuinely at new mothers, and coo appropriately over newborns. Her colleagues admired her professionalism, unaware of how she sometimes locked herself in the supply closet for 5 precious minutes of silent tears before returning to her patients. Dr. Harrison, the town's only obstetrician, had run every test he could think of over the years. "Everything looks normal, Sarah," he would say with practiced compassion. "Sometimes these things just take time." But time was the one thing Sarah felt slipping away. At 32, she wasn't old, but she could feel the weight of each passing month. "Have you considered that the issue might not be with you?" Dr. Harrison had suggested gently during her last visit. "Thomas could come in for some tests." Sarah had nodded, knowing it would never happen. In Thomas's family, fertility was a point of pride. For generations, Mitchell men had fathered large families. The suggestion that Thomas might be the cause of their childlessness would be an insult to his very identity. Spring arrived in Willowbrook with an explosion of wildflowers and renewed hope. The annual Founders' Day celebration brought the entire town to the central square, where food stalls, craft booths, and carnival games created a festive atmosphere. Sarah stood at the hospital's first aid booth, handing out bandages for minor, scrapes and sunscreen for those who had underestimated the April sun. Thomas was across the square with his father, manning the Mitchell Ranch barbecue station, where their famous beef brisket always drew the longest lines. "Nurse Mitchell, could you help me with this splinter?" A young voice pulled Sarah from her. In thoughts, looking down, she saw 10-year-old Lily Carter holding up her finger. "Of course, sweetheart, let's take a look." Sarah patted the chair beside her. As she carefully extracted the tiny sliver of wood from Lily's finger, she felt someone watching her. Looking up, she met the eyes of an elderly woman she didn't recognize. The woman stood apart from the crowds, her long silver hair braided down her back, her dark eyes intent on Sarah. "There you go, all better," Sarah said to Lily, placing a small bandage over the spot. "Be careful on those wooden benches, okay?" Lily nodded and ran back to her friends. But Sarah's attention remained on the mysterious woman. There was something compelling about her presence, a dignity and awareness that seemed to extend beyond the festive chaos around them. When her shift at the first aid booth ended, Sarah made her way through the crowd toward the food stalls, intending to get some lunch. To her surprise, she found the silver-haired woman standing directly in her path. "You carry great sadness," the woman said without preamble, her voice low and melodic with a slight accent Sarah couldn't place. Sarah took an instinctive step back. "Excuse me." "Here." The woman gestured to Sarah's abdomen. "The emptiness causes you pain." A cold shock ran through Sarah's body. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said defensively, though her voice trembled slightly. The woman's expression softened. "I am Nora Blackhawk. I was born to the Comanche people, but I have lived in many worlds. I know what troubles you." Sarah glanced around, worried that others might be listening, but the festival-goers moved past them, oblivious to their conversation. "Fine, really," Sarah insisted. "Now, if you'll excuse me—" "The answers you seek are not in your doctor's office," Nora continued calmly. "They are buried in old secrets. When you are ready to find them, come to the Blue House at the edge of Whispering Pine Creek." Before Sarah could respond, Thomas appeared at her side, 2 paper plates of food in his hands. "I brought you a sandwich," he said, then noticed Nora. "Hello," he added politely. Nora's gaze shifted to Thomas, and something in her expression changed. "Mr. Mitchell," she acknowledged with a slight nod. Thomas looked confused. "I'm sorry, have we met?" "No," Nora replied, "but I knew your grandfather." Thomas's interest visibly piqued. "You knew my grandfather, William? Not many people around here remember him." "I remember all the Mitchells," Nora said cryptically. Then, with a final, meaningful glance at Sarah, she melted into the crowd. "Who was that?" Thomas asked, handing Sarah her sandwich. "Her name is Nora Blackhawk. She said she's Comanche." Sarah took the food automatically, her mind still processing the strange encounter. Thomas's expression darkened slightly. Black Hawk? My father mentioned that name once. I think there was some dispute over land a long time ago. You should probably stay away from her. Sarah nodded absently, but Nora's words echoed in her mind. The answers you seek are not in your doctor's office. They are buried in old secrets. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Thomas lay beside her, his breathing deep and even, untroubled by the thoughts that kept her staring at the ceiling. After an hour of restlessness, she slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As she waited for the kettle to boil for tea, Sarah found herself drawn to the box of old photographs Thomas had inherited when his grandfather died. They rarely looked at them. Thomas wasn't sentimental about family history, but tonight something compelled her to pull the box from the top shelf of their hallway closet. Sitting at the kitchen table with her tea, Sarah began to sort through the black and white images. Most were formal portraits of stern-faced men and women, the Mitchell ancestors who had built the ranching empire. William Mitchell, Thomas's grandfather, appeared in several films, a broad-shouldered man with the same square jaw Thomas had inherited. Near the bottom of the box, a photograph caught her attention. Unlike the others, it was casual, a young William standing with a Native American woman beside a creek. They weren't touching, but there was an intimacy in their stance, a familiarity. Sarah turned the photo over. In faded pencil, someone had written, "William and Ava, Whispering Pine Creek, 1953. Sarah stared at the image, questions forming in her mind. Thomas had never mentioned an Ava, certainly not a Native American woman his grandfather had been photographed. With an Whispering Pine Creek, wasn't that where Nora Black Hawk had said she lived? "What are you doing up?" Sarah startled at Thomas's voice. He stood in the doorway in his pajama pants, hair tousled from sleep. "I couldn't sleep," she explained, instinctively covering the photograph with her hand. "Just having some tea." Thomas yawned. "Come back to bed. You have an early shift tomorrow." Sarah nodded, quickly returning the photos to the box. "I'll be right there." But as she placed the box back in the closet, she slipped the photograph of William and Ava into the pocket of her robe. Something told her it was important, though she couldn't have explained why. The following week brought Eleanor Mitchell's annual spring garden party, an event Sarah usually dreaded. The wives of Willowbrook's most prominent families would gather on the Mitchell estate's manicured lawn, drinking lemonade and exchanging gossip beneath flowered sun hats. Inevitably, the conversation would turn to children and grandchildren, leaving Sarah to smile politely through her discomfort. This year, however, Sarah found herself observing Eleanor with new interest. If the photograph meant what she suspected, it might. Eleanor could hold answers to questions Sarah hadn't even formulated yet. "Sarah, dear, would you help me bring out the deviled eggs?" Eleanor called, gesturing from the kitchen doorway. Inside the grand kitchen, away from the other guests, Eleanor handed Sarah a crystal platter. "Make sure to arrange them nicely," she instructed. "Mrs. Bradford is very particular about presentation, and her son is a potential investor in the ranch's expansion." Sarah carefully placed the eggs on the platter, then paused. "Eleanor, I was looking through some old family photographs recently. I noticed one of William with a Native American woman. I think the name Ava was written on the back." The glass pitcher Eleanor was filling with lemonade stilled momentarily. "You must be mistaken," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "I don't recall any such photograph or person." "It was taken at Whispering Pine Creek in 1953, Sarah persisted. "I was just curious about who she was." Eleanor set the pitcher down with more force than necessary, sloshing lemonade onto the counter. "The Mitchells have owned this land for generations. Any Native Americans in the area would have been employees, nothing more." Now those eggs won't serve themselves. Sarah recognized the dismissal, but couldn't help pushing further. I met someone at the Founders' Day celebration who said she knew William, a Comanche woman named Nora Blackhawk. The color drained from Eleanor's face. Black Hawk, she repeated almost to herself. Then, composing herself, she fixed Sarah with a hard stare. That family has caused nothing but trouble for the Mitchells. I forbid you to speak with that woman again. Do you understand me? The vehemence in Eleanor's reaction confirmed Sarah's suspicion that there was indeed a story here, one the Mitchells had worked hard to bury. I'm your daughter-in-law, Eleanor, not your child, Sarah replied quietly. You can't forbid me from talking to anyone. Eleanor drew herself up to her full height. Perhaps that's the problem. If you were truly part of this family, you would respect our wishes and our privacy. Instead, after 6 years of marriage to my son, you have given him nothing. No children, no legacy, nothing but embarrassment when people ask when they can expect grandchildren. The cruelty of the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Is that what Thomas thinks too? Eleanor's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing she had gone too far. Thomas loves you, dear, but a man needs children, sons to carry on his name, his legacy. The Mitchells have always been prolific. It's in our blood. There it was again, that phrase. It's in our blood. Something clicked in Sarah's mind, a possibility she had never considered before. That night, as Thomas slept, Sarah opened her laptop and began to research Comanche healing practices and the history of the Blackhawk family in Oklahoma. Hours passed as she followed one digital thread after another, uncovering fragments that hinted at a greater story. Nora Blackhawk was mentioned in several local newspaper archives as a controversial figure, a traditional healer who blended Comanche medicine with modern healthcare approaches. She had been a nurse during the Vietnam War before returning to Oklahoma to study with tribal elders. Most intriguing, there were vague references to a land dispute between the Blackhawks and the Mitchells in the 1950s, though details were sparse. Dawn was breaking when Sarah finally closed her laptop. The decision had formed in her mind sometime during the night's research. She would visit Nora Blackhawk at Whispering Pine Creek. Whatever secrets lay buried in the past, they might hold the key to her future. 2 days later, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in years. She waited until Thomas left for the ranch, then changed into jeans and a simple blouse, tucked the old photograph into her purse, and got into her car. Whispering Pine Creek was about 30 minutes outside of Willowbrook, in an area where the flat farmland began to give way to more rugged terrain. Following the directions she had found online, Sarah drove until she spotted a small blue house set back from the road, partially hidden by towering pine trees. As she parked and approached the house, uncertainty gripped her. What was she doing here, seeking out a stranger based on a cryptic conversation and an old photograph? She was a practical woman, a nurse who believed in science and medicine, yet here she was, following what felt like a thread of fate. Before she could knock, the door opened. Nora Blackhawk stood in the doorway, as if she had been expecting Sarah. You found the photograph," Nora said simply. Sarah blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" "Come inside," Nora replied, stepping back to allow Sarah entry. "Some conversation shouldn't be had on doorsteps." The interior of the small house was unexpectedly bright, with large windows overlooking the creek. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with a combination of medical texts and what appeared to be handwritten journals. A collection of plants hung from the ceiling, drying in the warm air. "Tea," Nora offered, gesturing to a small wooden table. Sarah nodded, taking a seat. As Nora prepared the tea, Sarah removed the photograph from her purse and placed it on the table. "Who is she?" Sarah asked. "Who is Ava?" Nora brought 2 steaming mugs to the table and sat across from Sarah. She picked up the photograph, her weathered fingers tracing the image gently. "Ava Blackhawk was my sister," she said, "and she was William Mitchell's first love." Sarah's heart raced. First love? But I thought William married Eleanor's sister, Catherine. He did, eventually, but before that, he loved Ava. Nora set the photograph down. They met when they were both 20. William had just taken over management of the East Pastures, which bordered our family's land. Ava was studying to be a healer, learning from our grandmother. What happened between them? Sarah asked, sensing the story's tragic undertone. Nora took a sip of her tea before answering. They kept their relationship secret for nearly 2 years. William's father would never have approved. But when Ava became pregnant, they planned to run away together. Nora's gaze drifted to the window, where the creek sparkled in the midday sun. Their plan never came to fruition. William's father discovered their relationship and threatened to disinherit him completely. But that wasn't what broke them apart. Sarah leaned forward, captivated. What happened? Richard Mitchell, Thomas's father, was only 16 then, but already devoted to preserving the family name. He found out about William and Ava's plan to leave and told his father. Nora's voice hardened. That night, several men from town came to our family's home. They claimed we were trespassing on Mitchell land, though our family had lived there for generations. They burned our cabin to the ground, Sarah gasped. That's terrible. Was anyone hurt? Our grandmother stayed behind while we ran for help. She died in the fire. Nora's eyes reflected old pain. But that wasn't all we lost that night. The shock and terror caused Ava to miscarry William's child. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm room. Did William know? He came looking for her the next day, but our father had already taken us to stay with relatives in another county. By the time Ava recovered enough to return, William had become engaged to Catherine Walker, the socially appropriate match his family had chosen. That's the grandmother Thomas never knew, Sarah murmured. She died before he was born. Nora nodded. Catherine was kind, but frail. After she gave birth to Richard, she was never healthy again. She died when Richard was only 5. Sarah struggled to process this buried history. But what does this have to do with me, with my situation? Nora studied Sarah carefully. The Mitchells have a family secret they've hidden for generations, one that affects you directly. But before I continue, I need to ask you something important. Does your husband ever get sick? The question caught Sarah off guard. Thomas? No, hardly ever. Even when everyone at the ranch catches the flu, he usually stays healthy. His mother always says it's the Mitchell constitution. They're naturally robust. And his father, his grandfather. Sarah thought about it. Richard had heart surgery a few years ago, but he recovered remarkably quickly. The doctors were amazed, and Thomas said his grandfather lived to 92 and was active until the end. Nora nodded, unsurprised. And what about Thomas's female relatives, his cousins, his aunts? Well, his mother has struggled with various health issues over the years, and now that you mention it, Thomas's sister, Emily, has had 3 miscarriages. Sarah paused, a new thought occurring to her. Eleanor blamed Emily's husband's family for having weak blood, but Emily's doctor never found a medical explanation. Just as no doctor has found a reason for your inability to conceive, Nora said pointedly. Sarah felt a surge of defensive anger. Are you saying there's something wrong with the Mitchells? That Thomas is the reason we can't have children? Not exactly, Nora replied calmly. I'm saying there's something different about the Mitchell men that modern medicine hasn't identified. Something my grandmother recognized in William all those years ago. Sarah's nursing training made her skeptical. What could a traditional healer know that modern medical testing wouldn't detect? Nora rose and retrieved an old leather-bound journal from one of the bookshelves. My grandmother documented everything she learned about healing. After she died, Ava continued her work, and then I did the same. She opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. This is what she wrote about William Mitchell. Sarah read the handwritten entry, her medical background, allowing her to decipher the mixture of Comanche terms and English medical observations. The Mitchell bloodline carries an unusual trait. Their male children possess blood that fights against foreign elements with uncommon strength. This gives them robust health and long life. But when they attempt to create new life with women not of their bloodline, their seed attacks the woman's womb as if it were an invader. Only a woman with equally strong blood can bear a Mitchell child. Sarah looked up, her mind racing. This sounds like an immune response, like histocompatibility. Nora appeared impressed. You understand medical science? I'm a nurse, Sarah explained. What you're describing sounds similar to Rh incompatibility, but that's easily detected and treated now. She paused, thinking. But there are other compatibility issues that aren't routinely tested for, especially in fertility cases. My grandmother called it warrior blood, Nora said. She believed certain families carried special traits in their bloodlines, some beneficial, some harmful. The Mitchells' blood protected them from disease and granted them strength, but it came at a cost. If this is true, Sarah said slowly, how did the Mitchell line continue? How did Catherine have Richard? That's where the family secret lies, Nora replied. Catherine Walker had Comanche ancestry through her maternal grandmother. The Walkers hid this fact socially, but William's father knew. It's why he opposed a match with Ava, but accepted Catherine. He knew from family history that Mitchell men needed wives with certain bloodlines to produce children. Sarah's mind was spinning with implications. Are you saying I can't have children with Thomas because I don't have the right genetic background? I'm saying there's a compatibility issue that no modern test has identified, Nora clarified. But my grandmother developed a treatment for Ava in case she and William reconciled. The same treatment might help you. A treatment? Sarah's scientific skepticism warred with desperate hope. What kind of treatment? A series of herbal preparations that alter your body's response to Thomas's seed, Nora explained, combined with specific timing around your fertility cycle. Sarah ran her hands through her hair, overwhelmed. This sounds like pseudoscience. I've had every fertility test available. Yet no doctor has found anything wrong, Nora pointed out, and the Mitchell family history shows a pattern consistent with what my grandmother documented. How many Mitchell wives throughout the generations have struggled with fertility issues? How many have been blamed and shamed for problems that weren't their fault? The question struck at Sarah's deepest vulnerability. For years, she had carried the burden of their childlessness alone. Thomas never explicitly blamed her, but his silence during his mother's criticisms spoke volumes. Does Thomas know about this family trait? Sarah asked. I doubt it, Nora replied. After what happened with Ava, William became fiercely protective of the family reputation. He would have buried the truth, especially about their Native American connections. Each generation probably knows less than the one before. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing the small room. This is a lot to process. Even if I believed all this, how could I explain suddenly seeking treatment from a Comanche healer to Thomas? His mother has already forbidden me from speaking to you. Eleanor fears anything that threatens her family's carefully constructed identity, Nora said. But you don't need to explain anything yet. Take time to consider what I've told you. If you decide to try the treatment, we can be discreet. Sarah stopped at the window, watching the creek water flow smoothly over worn stones. The science-minded nurse in her remained skeptical, but another part, the woman who had endured years of monthly disappointment and growing isolation, whispered that she had nothing to lose. "May I see this treatment?" she asked finally. Nora nodded and led Sarah to a small room off the main living area. Inside, dried plants hung from the ceiling, and glass jars of various sizes lined wooden shelves. A modern microscope sat beside traditional stone grinding tools on a work table. "I bridged two worlds," Nora explained, noting Sarah's surprise at the scientific equipment. "I studied nursing before returning to my grandmother's teachings. I don't reject modern medicine. I complement it." She opened a small refrigerator and removed a glass bottle containing a dark liquid. "This is the primary preparation. It contains herbs that modulate immune response and increase fertility. Some of these same plants are being studied by pharmaceutical companies now, though they don't acknowledge their indigenous origins." Sarah recognized some of the labeled ingredients from her medical training, plants with documented anti-inflammatory and hormone-balancing properties. The combination, however, was unlike any protocol she'd encountered. "How would I take it?" she asked, medical curiosity overtaking her skepticism. 3 times daily for 1 full moon cycle before attempting conception," Nora instructed. "There are also specific preparations for Thomas, though those would be more challenging to administer without his knowledge." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. "You expect me to give him medicine without telling him?" "Ideally, you would both participate." "Knowingly," Nora acknowledged. "My grandmother believed healing worked best when all parties consented, but I understand your situation's complexity." Sarah handed the bottle back. "I need time to think." "Of course," Nora said. "But there's something else you should know. The photographs and journals I've shown you aren't all the evidence of the Mitchell family's connection to ours." From a small wooden box, Nora withdrew a gold pocket watch. She opened it to reveal an inscription: "To William, my heart across time. Ava, 1953. William came to see my sister one last time before he died," Nora said quietly. "He gave her this watch as a parting gift. He told her he had never stopped loving her, but that he had made choices he couldn't undo." Sarah stared at the watch, physical proof of a love story buried by time and family secrets. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you deserve to know the truth before you decide your path." "Forward," Nora replied. "The Mitchells have maintained their bloodline and their power in this community through secrets and sometimes cruelty. You've been made to bear shame that was never yours to carry." On the drive back to Willowbrook, Sarah's mind raced with everything she had learned. The scientific part of her remained skeptical of Nora's explanation, yet the pattern she described matched the Mitchell family history too perfectly to dismiss entirely. She parked on Main Street and walked to the local library, where town records dating back to the 1800s were kept. For the next 2 hours, she pored over marriage certificates, birth records, and old newspaper announcements, tracking the Mitchell family through generations. A pattern emerged that sent chills down her spine. In every generation, multiple Mitchell men married and produced children, but only with women from a small number of families in the region. Moreover, many of these families had documented connections to Native American tribes. Those Mitchell men who married outside this circle either remained childless or had significantly fewer children, often with large gaps between pregnancies, suggesting fertility struggles. Thomas's own grandmother, Catherine, had indeed been a Walker, and the Walkers' family history included a great-grandmother who was identified in one document as mixed-blood Comanche. Richard had married Eleanor Jenkins, whose maternal line traced back to a Cherokee family that had refused relocation during the Trail of Tears. The evidence supported Nora's claim. Something in the Mitchell bloodline created a compatibility issue that limited their ability to have children with women from certain genetic backgrounds. By the time Sarah left the library, dusk was falling. She drove home in a daze, parking in the driveway of the house that had begun to feel like a beautiful prison. Inside, she found Thomas in the kitchen, heating leftover casserole. "Where have you been?" he asked, concerned rather than accusation in his voice. "I called the hospital when you didn't answer your phone, and they said you called in sick." Sarah realized she had left her phone in her purse, silenced during her library research. "I needed some time to myself," she answered honestly. "To think," Thomas's face fell slightly, "about us, about everything." Sarah sat at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted. "Thomas, why did you marry me?" He looked startled by the question. "Because I love you. You know that." "Did you ever wonder why your mother opposed our engagement so strongly?" Sarah pressed. "She never said I wasn't good enough directly, but she suggested every other woman in town as a better match." Thomas sighed, abandoning the microwave to sit across from Sarah. "My mother has strong opinions about everything. You know how traditional she is about family connections." "Yes, family connections," Sarah repeated. "Did you know your grandmother Catherine had Native American ancestry?" Thomas's expression registered surprise. "What? No, that's not possible. The Walkers were one of the founding families of Willowbrook." "They were," Sarah confirmed, "but Catherine's maternal grandmother was Comanche. It's documented in the county records." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "Why were you researching my family history? And why would that even matter?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Because I think it might explain why we haven't been able to have children." For the next hour, Sarah carefully explained everything she had learned from Nora Blackhawk and her subsequent research at the library. She watched Thomas's expressions shift from skepticism to disbelief to troubled consideration as the pattern in his family's history became clear. "This sounds like some kind of folk tale," he said finally. "A special bloodline? Immune compatibility that modern medicine can't detect? My grandfather's secret Native American lover? It's far-fetched, Sarah." "I know how it sounds," she acknowledged. "I'm a nurse. I believe in science. But science also teaches us that there are things we haven't fully understood yet. Look at the records, Thomas. Look at the pattern in your own family." "Even if there's some truth to this," Thomas said, rubbing his temples, "what does it change? Are you saying we can never have children?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about Nora's offered treatment. "I'm saying that the problem might not be with me. After 6 years of tests and treatments and your mother's veiled accusations, maybe we should consider other possibilities." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with realization. "All those years, watching you blame yourself, the way my mother treated you. If this is true, then we've been wrong all along. It's not about placing blame elsewhere," Sarah said gently. "It's about finding the truth so we can decide our path forward." "What path?" Thomas asked, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "If what you're saying is true, then we're genetically incompatible. There's no future for us with children." Sarah reached across the table to take his hand. "There might be," she said cautiously. "Nora Blackhawk claims her grandmother developed a treatment specifically for this condition, herbs and medicines that might allow us to conceive." Thomas withdrew his hand, his expression hardening. "So that's what this is about. That woman has convinced you to try some kind of traditional remedy. Sarah, you're a medical professional. You know better than to trust unproven treatments." "I know that modern medicine hasn't provided any answers," Sarah countered, frustration rising. "I know that I've been carrying the burden of our childlessness for 6 years, while you stood by and said nothing when your mother called me Barren. I know that when I look at the evidence, Nora's explanation makes more sense than anything a doctor has told me." They stared at each other across the kitchen table, the distance between them suddenly vast. Thomas was the first to look away. "I need some air," he said, standing abruptly. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and left the house. Sarah remained at the table, listening to his truck start and pull away. She had known this conversation wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't anticipated the depth of Thomas's resistance. It wasn't just skepticism about Nora's treatment. It was an unwillingness to question the Mitchell family narrative that had shaped his entire identity. After Thomas left, Sarah found herself drawn to the yellow nursery room they had painted years ago. Standing in the doorway, she allowed herself to imagine a child there, their child, a blend of her and Thomas, a new generation that would merge their bloodlines. For the first time in years, hope flickered to life within her. If Nora was right, there was a path forward, not just to motherhood, but to healing the rift that had been growing between her and Thomas. But first, she would need to convince him to open his mind to possibilities beyond the story his family had told themselves for generations. Sarah reached for her phone and composed a text message to Thomas. "I love you. When you're ready to talk, I'll be here. This doesn't have to be the end of our dream. It could be a new beginning." As she pressed send, Sarah realized she had reached a turning point. Whatever Thomas decided, she now knew that the shame and failure she had carried for years were based on a lie. The path forward might be difficult, but for the first time, she could see beyond the shadow of barrenness that had defined her marriage. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered over Willowbrook. Sarah watched from the window as lightning illuminated the darkening sky, a fitting backdrop to the upheaval in her life. Unlike previous storms, however, this one carried the promise of renewal rather than just destruction. The rain, when it came, would wash away old lies and nourish new truths waiting to emerge from long-buried seeds. Thomas didn't return home that night. Sarah's calls went straight to voicemail, and her text messages remained unanswered. As midnight approached, she finally called his best friend, Jason Cooper. "He's here," Jason confirmed, his tone cautious. "He's pretty shaken up, Sarah. Said you two had some kind of fight about his family." "Is he okay?" Sarah asked, relief mixing with worry. "He's had a few beers, but he's calmed down. He just needs some space to process whatever's going on between you two." After hanging up, Sarah tried to sleep, but found herself staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's revelations. By morning, exhaustion had given way to resolve. If Thomas wouldn't come to her, she would go to the one person who might help him understand the truth, his father. Richard Mitchell had always been the quieter counterpart to Eleanor's forceful personality. While never openly affectionate toward Sarah, he had been cordial, occasionally defending her subtly when Eleanor's criticisms became too pointed. If anyone in the family might listen, it would be him. The Mitchell ranch was already bustling with activity when Sarah arrived. Ranch hands moved between outbuildings, and the smell of livestock mingled with the fresh morning air. Sarah found Richard in the old barn, examining a piece of broken equipment. "Sarah," he said, surprised, "Thomas isn't here. I thought he was at home with you." "He stayed at Jason's last night," Sarah replied. "We had a disagreement about your family history." Richard's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Family history? What aspect of it?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I know about William and Ava Blackhawk. I know about the Walker's Comanche heritage. And I know why the Mitchell men can only have children with women from certain bloodlines." The wrench in Richard's hand clattered to the ground. His weathered face paled as he stared at Sarah in stunned silence. "How did you?" he finally managed. "I met Nora Blackhawk," Sarah said, "and then I did my own research in the town records." Richard sagged against a wooden post. "Eleanor doesn't know that I know," he said quietly. "She thinks the family secret died with my father." "But you found out," Sarah prompted. He nodded slowly. "Just before my wedding to Eleanor. My father, took me aside and told me I was making a mistake, not because Eleanor wasn't suitable, but because she came from the right bloodline. He was drunk, rambling about warrior blood and family curses. Did you believe him? Sarah asked. Not at first, Richard admitted, but Eleanor and I struggled for years to conceive Thomas. We lost 2 pregnancies before he was born. The doctors never found a reason. He paused, pain crossing his features. After Thomas, we tried for another child for a decade without success. That's when I started looking into my father's claims. And you discovered he was telling the truth, Sarah said. Not a question. Richard met her gaze directly. I traced the family history back 5 generations. Every successful Mitchell marriage followed the same pattern. I even found my grandfather's journal, where he wrote about selecting a wife with the right blood mixture to ensure strong children. Sarah absorbed this confirmation of everything Nora had told her. Does Thomas know any of this? Richard shook his head. Eleanor would never allow it. She spent her life crafting the perfect image of the Mitchell legacy. The truth would destroy everything she believes about her place in this community. The truth is destroying my marriage, Sarah countered. Thomas deserves to know why we haven't been able to have children, that it's not my failure or his, but a biological incompatibility that has affected Mitchell men for generations. Richard looked away, conflict evident in his expression. What do you want from me, Sarah? Talk to Thomas, she pleaded. He won't believe me, but he might believe his father. Help him understand that this doesn't diminish the Mitchell name. It's simply a medical reality that explains what we've been experiencing. Before Richard could respond, the barn door swung open. Eleanor stood in the entrance, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene before her. What's going on here? She demanded. Sarah, Thomas called looking for you. He sounded upset. Richard straightened, a decision visibly forming in his posture. Eleanor, Sarah knows about William and Ava Blackhawk. She knows about the Mitchell bloodline. Eleanor's face froze in an expression of horrified disbelief. What are you talking about, Richard? There's nothing to know. Stop it, Eleanor, Richard said with unexpected firmness. I've known the truth for 30 years. My father told me before our wedding, and I've seen the evidence in our family records. It's time to stop pretending. Eleanor's composed facade cracked. You knew all this time? Her voice trembled with rage and betrayal. How could you keep this from me? The same way you've kept it from everyone else, Richard replied quietly, out of misguided pride. Eleanor turned her fury toward Sarah. This is your doing. You've been speaking with that witch at Whispering Pine Creek, haven't you? After I expressly forbade it, I went looking for answers, Sarah said, standing her ground. After years of being made to feel like a failure in this family, I deserved to know the truth. The truth? Eleanor spat. The truth is that you want to destroy this family with lies and superstitions. Native American blood in the Walkers. Impossible. We are one of the founding families of this town. It's documented in the county records, Eleanor, Sarah replied calmly. Catherine Walker's maternal grandmother was Comanche. Just as many of the other women who successfully married into the Mitchell family had Native American ancestry. This is absurd, Eleanor insisted, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Richard, you can't possibly believe this nonsense. I've seen the records myself, Richard said heavily. My father showed me before he died. The Mitchell men have always needed wives with certain compatible bloodlines. It's why he urged me to reconsider marrying you. Eleanor recoiled as if slapped. What are you saying? I'm saying we were lucky to have Thomas, Richard continued gently. After him, you blamed yourself for not giving me more children. I let you believe that, and I'm sorry. But the truth is, we were genetically incompatible in a way modern medicine still doesn't fully understand. Eleanor sank onto a nearby hay bale, her carefully maintained dignity crumbling. "All these years," she whispered. "The treatments, the prayers, the shame." Sarah felt a surprising surge of empathy for the woman who had caused her so much pain. Eleanor, too, had carried the burden of perceived failure, had internalized it until it became part of her identity. "It doesn't have to be this way anymore," Sarah said quietly. "Thomas and I deserve to know the truth about our situation. And there might be a solution, a treatment Nora Blackhawk's grandmother developed specifically for this condition." Eleanor's head snapped up, suspicion replacing vulnerability. "Native American folk medicine? That's your solution? Thomas would never agree to such nonsense." "That's for Thomas to decide," came a voice from the doorway. All three turned to find Thomas standing there, his expression unreadable. "Jason's wife works at the library," he explained. "She told him about Sarah's research yesterday. I've been there all morning looking at the same records." "Thomas," Eleanor began, rising to her feet, "don't listen to these ridiculous claims. The Mitchell name is built on secrets and shame," Thomas interrupted. "I've seen the pattern, Mother. I've seen the birth records and the family trees. Every successful Mitchell marriage for 5 generations follows the same pattern. It can't be a coincidence." He walked to Sarah, taking her hand in a gesture that sent relief flooding through her. "I'm sorry I walked out last night. I was shocked, and afraid that if what you were saying was true, we might never have children." "There might be a way," Sarah said softly. "Nora Blackhawk is waiting for us," Thomas finished. "I went to see her this morning after the library. She told me about her grandmother's treatment, about how it was developed specifically to help Mitchell men and their wives conceive." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You went to Nora?" Thomas nodded. "I needed to see for myself. She showed me the journals, the records her family kept. She even had blood samples from her sister and my grandfather that she'd preserved and studied. Medical science is complex, but it makes sense, Sarah. There's something in my blood, in all Mitchell men's blood, that creates a specific immune response in women who don't share certain genetic markers." "This is preposterous," Eleanor protested, though her objection lacked conviction. "What would people say if they knew the Mitchells were seeking treatment from a Comanche healer? They might say we're finally acknowledging the truth of our heritage," Richard suggested quietly. "That we're honoring all the bloodlines that made our family strong." Thomas turned to his mother, his expression softening. "Mother, I understand this is difficult for you. Your entire life has been built around a certain view of our family history. But Sarah and I want children, your grandchildren. If Nora's treatment offers us that chance, how can we not try?" Eleanor looked from her son to her husband, then to Sarah, something shifting in her expression. "All I've ever wanted was for the Mitchell legacy to continue," she said finally, "for you to have the family you deserve, Thomas." "Then help us," Sarah urged. "Support us in this. Be part of the solution instead of perpetuating the problem." 3 days later, Sarah and Thomas sat in Nora Blackhawk's living room, watching as she prepared the first treatment. Eleanor had declined to accompany them, still processing the upheaval of her family's narrative, but Richard had surprised them by offering to drive them to Whispering Pine Creek. "The treatment takes 3 months, Nora explained, measuring herbs. "Into a mortar. Both of you must follow the protocol exactly. The timing is crucial, especially around Sarah's fertility cycle." Thomas watched intently as Nora worked. "My father mentioned that his father kept journals about this condition. Do you think those still exist somewhere?" "Possibly," Nora replied. "Your grandfather was a complicated man, but he took this family trait seriously. He would have documented his observations, especially after marrying Catherine and discovering her heritage allowed them to conceive." "I'd like to find those journals," Thomas said, "not just for us, but for future generations. This knowledge shouldn't be lost or hidden again." Sarah squeezed his hand, grateful for how completely he had embraced their new reality. "In just a Few days, he had transformed from skeptic to advocate, researching immune compatibility and ethnic genetic markers with the same determination he brought to ranch management. The treatment has three components, Nora continued. Daily herbal preparations that both of you will take, dietary changes that will strengthen Sarah's immune tolerance, and precisely timed intimacy around her peak fertility days. Despite the clinical nature of the discussion, Sarah felt a blush creep into her cheeks. Nora noticed and smiled gently. My grandmother believed that healing required addressing the body, mind and spirit, she said. The emotional connection between partners was as important as the physical treatments. Your love for each other is part of the medicine. Richard, who had been silently observing from a corner of the room, finally spoke. My wife and I followed every medical recommendation available 30 years ago, he said. None of the doctors could explain why we struggled after Thomas was born. If we had known about this treatment then. The past cannot be changed, Nora said kindly, but its lessons can guide the future. Your family's story is not just about a biological condition. It's about the cost of denying truth across generations. Each secret kept, each heritage hidden, created more suffering for those who came after. As Nora continued explaining the treatment protocol, Sarah found herself studying the old photograph of William and Ava that now sat framed on Nora's mantel. Two young people caught in a moment of happiness before family expectations and societal prejudices tore them apart. Their thwarted love had rippled through generations, creating patterns of secrecy and shame that had nearly destroyed her own marriage. Will this really work? Sarah asked quietly when Nora finished her instructions. There are no guarantees in medicine, traditional or modern, Nora answered honestly. But my sister treated 3 couples with this condition over her lifetime. All 3 eventually conceived. My grandmother treated 2 in her day with similar results. It wasn't the absolute certainty Sarah's scientific mind craved, but it offered more hope than 6 years of conventional treatments had provided. We'll follow the protocol exactly, Thomas promised, a new determination in his voice. Whatever it takes. The 3 months of treatment passed in a blur of daily routines, careful timing, and gradual healing, not just of bodies, but of relationships. To Sarah's surprise, Eleanor eventually joined their journey, hesitantly at first, then with growing conviction as she witnessed the changes in Sarah and Thomas's relationship. I was wrong, Eleanor admitted one evening as she helped Sarah prepare the herbal tea that was part of the daily treatment. Not just about Nora's methods, but about you. I blamed you for something that was never your fault. I projected my own sense of failure onto you. Sarah paused in her work, touched by the unexpected apology. We were all victims of secrets kept too long, she said gently. But now we have a chance to break that cycle. Richard, too, found a measure of peace in acknowledging the truth. He spent hours with Nora, learning about the condition that had shaped his family's history, and began the process of documenting everything for future generations of Mitchells. In the 3rd month of treatment, Thomas discovered his grandfather's journals hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards of the old ranch office. The leather-bound books contained decades of observations about the Mitchell blood trait, including William's heartbreaking acknowledgement that his love for Ava had been sacrificed to family expectations. I chose the Mitchell name over love, he had written in a shaky hand, dated just weeks before his death. I pray my descendants will make wiser choices. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 14 weeks after beginning Nora's treatment, Sarah stared at the pregnancy test in her bathroom, hardly daring to believe the 2 pink lines that had appeared. 6 years of negative tests had taught her to guard her heart against hope, but this time felt different. Thomas, she called, her voice trembling slightly. He appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from curiosity to wonder as she held up the test. Are you? Sarah nodded, tears filling her eyes. It's positive. Thomas crossed the small bathroom in a single stride, gathering her into his arms with a whoop of joy that seemed to release years of pent-up emotion. We need to call Nora, he said, his voice thick, and my parents, and Dr. Harrison. He'll need to monitor you closely. Sarah laughed through her tears. One step at a time, she advised, though her own heart was racing with plans and possibilities. Let's make sure this is real first. But it was real. Dr. Harrison confirmed the pregnancy the following day, his initial skepticism about their alternative treatment giving way to professional interest as Sarah and Thomas explained the biological mechanism behind their previous struggles. This could be groundbreaking, he mused, making notes. There are likely other couples struggling with unexplained infertility who might have similar compatibility issues. With your permission, I'd like to consult with Nora Blackhawk about her methods. Of course, Sarah agreed, thinking of all the women who, like her, had shouldered blame and shame for conditions beyond their control. This knowledge should help others, not remain a secret. As word spread through Willowbrook about Sarah's pregnancy, the whispers that had once condemned her transformed into expressions of joy and support. The community that had once labeled her barren now celebrated her journey toward motherhood. Eleanor Mitchell, in perhaps the most surprising transformation of all, became Sarah's fiercest advocate and protector. The woman who had once viewed Nora Blackhawk as a threat to the Mitchell legacy now consulted her regularly about ensuring a healthy pregnancy, bridging generations of division between their families. 6 months into her pregnancy, Sarah stood, with Thomas at Whispering Pine Creek, watching the water flow over ancient stones that had witnessed countless stories unfold along its banks. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, feeling the strong kicks of the child growing within, a child who carried the merged bloodlines of generations. My grandfather would be proud, Thomas said, his arm around her shoulders. Not of the secrets he kept, but of how we've reclaimed the truth. Sarah leaned into his embrace, thinking of the journey that had brought them to this moment, from isolation and shame to understanding and acceptance, from barren to expectant mother, from broken to whole. The truth really does set you free, she murmured, watching the sunset paint the water with golden light, even when it's not the truth you expected to find. Thomas placed his hand over hers on her belly, feeling their child move beneath their joined fingers. Some truths are worth waiting for, he said simply, as they walked back toward Nora's blue house, where their extended families, Mitchell and Blackhawk alike, waited to celebrate together. Sarah reflected on how seeking answers had not just given her the child she had longed for. It had healed wounds that had festered across generations, reunited families separated by prejudice and pride, and restored connections that should never have been broken. The path had not been easy, but standing now at the threshold of motherhood, Sarah knew with certainty that every step of the journey had been necessary. The label that had once defined her, Barren, had been transformed into something more powerful, seeker of truth. And in that transformation, she had found not just a child, but her true place in the continuing story of family, heritage, and love that would extend far beyond her own lifetime. The remaining months of Sarah's pregnancy passed with a mixture of joy and caution. Despite the success of Nora's treatment, Dr. Harrison insisted on monitoring her closely, classifying her as high risk due to her history. Every appointment, every ultrasound, every heartbeat detected through the monitor was celebrated as a small victory in a battle they had once thought unwinnable. Winter settled over Willowbrook, covering the landscape in pristine white that seemed to symbolize the fresh start the Mitchell family had been given. The town prepared for Christmas, stringing lights along Main Street and erecting a towering pine in the square. For Sarah, the holiday season took on new meaning as she and Thomas transformed the yellow nursery from a room of broken dreams into a space of anticipation. "Do you think we should know if it's a boy or girl?" Thomas asked one evening as they assembled the crib his father had crafted by hand, "or keep it a surprise?" Sarah considered this as she smoothed the quilt Eleanor had made, a beautiful patchwork that incorporated fabric from multiple generations of both families, including a small square from Ava Blackhawk's shawl that Nora had contributed. "I'd like to be surprised," she decided. "We've planned so much of this journey. Let's allow this one thing to unfold naturally." Thomas smiled, coming to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her rounded belly. "I like that. Though I confess, I'm curious if the Mitchell blood trait passes only to male children, or if our daughter, if we have one, would carry it too." This scientific curiosity had become a common topic between them since discovering William's journals. The careful documentation across generations had revealed patterns they were still unraveling, including the observation that Mitchell women rarely face the same fertility challenges as the men. "Nora thinks it might be sex-linked," Sarah replied. "Carried on the Y chromosome, which would explain why it appears predominantly in males, though I suspect it's more complex than that." Their conversations often took this turn now, a blend of traditional knowledge and modern medical understanding that bridged their separate worlds. Thomas had become fascinated with genetics, reading everything he could find on immune response in pregnancy and hereditary traits. Sarah had deepened her appreciation for traditional healing practices, recognizing wisdom in approaches she had once dismissed as unscientific. Dr. Harrison had taken a similar interest, consulting regularly with Nora about her treatment protocol. Their unlikely collaboration had already helped another couple in Willowbrook who had struggled with unexplained infertility for years. "The Jenkins family," Thomas mused, when they heard the news of the couple's success. "Interesting that they would be compatible. There's no documented Native American ancestry in Lisa Jenkins' family." "Not documented," Sarah corrected gently. "But many families hid or lost those connections over generations of assimilation. The genetic markers remain, even when the stories are forgotten." This insight had sparked a community-wide reckoning in Willowbrook. Other families began researching their histories, discovering indigenous connections that had been obscured or denied. The local historical society established a project to document these forgotten lineages, creating a more complete picture of the town's founding and development. Eleanor Mitchell, surprisingly, had become one of the project's most dedicated volunteers. Her transformation from guardian of a sanitized family narrative to advocate for historical truth continued to amaze Sarah. "I spent my life believing that the Mitchell legacy was about preserving a particular version of our story," Eleanor confessed. One afternoon as she helped Sarah organize baby clothes. "Now I understand that our true legacy is in acknowledging all the threads that wove us together, even the ones we tried to cut away." January brought heavy snowfall that blanketed the region, isolating the more remote properties around Willowbrook. Sarah, now in her 8th month, found herself increasingly homebound, her mobility limited by her advanced pregnancy. Nora had moved temporarily into the guest room of their home, a practical arrangement given the weather and Sarah's condition, but also a powerful symbol of the healing between their families. On a particularly bitter night, with wind howling against the windows and the temperature dropping to record lows, Sarah awoke to sharp pains radiating across her abdomen. She lay still for a moment, hoping it was merely the practice contractions she had been experiencing for weeks. But when a second, stronger wave hit, she knew. "Thomas," she whispered, shaking her husband's shoulder. "I think it's time." He was instantly alert, years of ranching emergencies having trained him to wake fully at a moment's notice. "Are you sure?" You're not due for another 3 weeks. The baby has other ideas, Sarah managed through gritted teeth as another contraction built. And we need to hurry. The storm's getting worse. Thomas leapt from bed, pulling on clothes while simultaneously reaching for his phone. I'll call the hospital, let them know we're coming, and wake Nora. We might need her knowledge if we can't make it there. The next hour unfolded in a blur of activity. Nora helped Sarah dress in warm layers while Thomas attempted to clear the driveway. Enough to get the truck out. Richard arrived unexpectedly in his heavy-duty plow truck, having anticipated their need when the storm intensified. Eleanor's already at the hospital, he informed them as he helped Thomas guide Sarah through the snow. She went in earlier to deliver supplies for the storm response and decided to stay when the roads worsened. She's preparing everything for your arrival. The journey to Willowbrook Memorial normally took 15 minutes. That night, battling through near whiteout conditions on unplowed roads, it took nearly an hour. Sarah focused on her breathing techniques as the contractions intensified, drawing strength from Nora's calm presence beside her and Thomas's steady determination as he navigated the treacherous conditions. When they finally reached the hospital, Dr. Harrison was waiting with a team ready to assess Sarah immediately. "Good news," he announced after examining her. "Despite the early arrival, everything looks normal. The baby's in position, your vitals are strong, and you're progressing well. This little one is eager to meet the world, storm or no storm." Eleanor appeared at Sarah's side as they moved her to the delivery room, her face a mixture of anxiety and excitement. "I've contacted everyone, the family, the church prayer circle, even the Blackhawk relatives Nora wanted informed. This child already has a community waiting." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at this evidence of how completely her mother-in-law had embraced their expanded family circle. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching for Eleanor's hand as another contraction built. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, Sarah labored to bring new life into the world. Thomas never left her side, his strength unwavering as he supported her through each wave of pain. Nora and Dr. Harrison worked together in seamless coordination, bridging traditional wisdom and modern medicine in a way that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Just as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Sarah gave a final powerful push, and their child slipped into the waiting hands of Dr. Harrison. "It's a girl," he announced, his professional demeanor briefly overtaken by genuine joy. "A beautiful, healthy girl." The newborn's cries filled the room, strong and indignant at being thrust from her warm shelter into the cold world. Thomas cut the cord with trembling hands, and moments later, their daughter was placed on Sarah's chest, tiny and perfect and miraculous. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, counting fingers and toes through tears of exhaustion and overwhelming love. "We've waited so long for you." Thomas leaned down to kiss Sarah's forehead, then gently stroked their daughter's dark hair. "She's perfect," he murmured. "Absolutely perfect." As the medical team completed their work, Eleanor and Richard were allowed in briefly, their faces transformed by the wonder of meeting their first grandchild. Even in her exhaustion, Sarah noticed how Eleanor's usually perfect composure crumbled at the sight of the tiny bundle, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "She has the Mitchell chin," Richard observed with a watery smile. "And Sarah's eyes, I think." "She has the strength of all her ancestors," Nora added quietly from where she stood by the window. "Comanche, European, and all the bloodlines that came together to create her." Later, when the excitement had quieted and the first visitors had departed, Sarah and Thomas were left alone with their daughter. The storm had passed, leaving a crystalline landscape of pristine snow visible through the hospital window. Sunlight glinting off ice-laden trees, "What shall we name her?" Thomas asked, cradling the sleeping infant. "We never did decide." Sarah watched them together. This man who had journeyed with her from despair to joy, now holding the physical embodiment of their love and perseverance. "I was thinking, Ava," she suggested, "for your grandfather's first love, for the story that was never allowed to reach its conclusion, but that ultimately led us here." Thomas looked down at their daughter, considering. "Ava," he repeated softly, "I like it, but what about a middle name?" "Catherine," Sarah decided, "for your grandmother, who carried her heritage silently but passed it down nonetheless." "Ava." "Catherine Mitchell," Thomas pronounced, "a name that honors both sides of her history." The news of Ava's birth spread quickly through Willowbrook, bringing a steady stream of visitors despite the challenging road conditions. Floral arrangements, hand-knitted blankets and home-cooked meals began arriving almost immediately. Among the visitors were couples who had struggled with fertility issues similar to Sarah and Thomas's, some already working with Nora and Dr. Harrison, others seeking information about the treatment that had succeeded where conventional medicine had failed. Dr. Harrison, with Sarah and Thomas's permission, had begun documenting their case for a medical journal, though he was careful to protect their privacy. This could represent a breakthrough in understanding certain types of unexplained infertility, he explained, as he examined Ava during her first checkup. Especially in families with mixed genetic heritage that isn't apparent from physical appearance or documented family history. 1 week after Ava's birth, when Sarah and Thomas had settled into the exhausting but joyful rhythm of new parenthood, a surprising visitor arrived at their door. Jason Cooper, Thomas's best friend, appeared with his wife Laura, carrying not flowers or baby clothes, but a dusty wooden box. "We found this in the public library archives," Laura explained as they settled in the living room, Ava sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. "I'm on the Historical Preservation Committee, remember? We've been cataloguing old documents stored in the basement." Thomas opened the box carefully. Inside lay a collection of letters, their paper yellowed with age, tied with faded ribbon. "They're from William Mitchell to Ava Blackhawk," Jason said quietly, "written over decades, though never sent. The librarian who preserved them years ago included a note explaining that William brought them to the library just before his death, with instructions that they be kept sealed until 50 years had passed." Sarah and Thomas exchanged startled glances. That was 3 years ago, Thomas realized. They've been sitting there, waiting to be discovered. "We thought you should have them," Laura said, "given everything that's happened," and she nodded toward the sleeping infant, her name. After their friends departed, Thomas carefully untied the ribbon binding the letters. He and Sarah spent the evening reading William's words, written across a lifetime of separation from the woman he had truly loved. The early letters burned with youthful passion and regret. The middle ones detailed his life with Catherine, his guilt at finding happiness while knowing Ava remained alone. The later ones, written in an increasingly shaky hand, reflected on choices made and paths not taken. The final letter, dated just weeks before William's death, contained a passage that brought tears to both their eyes. "I have watched the Mitchell line continue through my son and now my grandson. I have seen how our family's unique blood trait has shaped each generation's journey. I carried the secret of our condition because I was taught that our differences made us special, elite even. Now, as my life draws to its close, I see that our true strength was never in isolation, but in connection, in the blending of bloodlines, in the love between people from different worlds. The treatment my beloved Ava's grandmother created saved her family line, though few of us have acknowledged this debt. My hope for future generations is that they will not repeat my mistakes, that they will acknowledge all parts of their heritage, that they will choose love over pride, truth over comfortable lies, to any descendant who may someday read these. Your words know that the barriers we create between peoples are illusions. We are all connected in ways science is only beginning to understand. The Mitchell warrior blood that I was taught to revere as pure is actually the result of mixing, of diversity, of love that transcended boundaries. Remember this, and honor all the streams that flow into the river of your existence. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks as Thomas folded the final letter. He understood, she said softly. At the end, he understood what we've only just discovered. Thomas nodded, gazing down at their sleeping daughter. And now Ava will grow up knowing the whole truth from the beginning. No secrets, no shame, just the beautiful complexity of her heritage. Spring arrived early that year, bringing an explosion of wildflowers across the Oklahoma landscape. On a perfect April afternoon, a gathering unlike any Willowbrook had seen before took place at Whispering Pine Creek. Members of the Mitchell family, the Blackhawk family, and others from the community assembled to witness a ceremony that bridged cultures, generations, and once bitter divisions. Beneath an arbor woven with native flowers, 3-month-old Ava Catherine Mitchell was blessed in a ceremony that incorporated elements from both sides of her heritage. Richard and Eleanor stood proudly beside Thomas and Sarah as Nora performed traditional Comanche blessings. Dr. Harrison attended with his wife, representing the bridge between medical traditions that had made Ava's existence possible. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah stepped forward to address the gathered community. 6 years ago, I was labeled Barren and made to feel like a failure because my body wouldn't produce the children my husband's family expected. I carried that shame silently, believing the problem lay solely with me. Many of you witnessed my pain, though few understood its cause. She gazed around at the faces watching her, some familiar, some new, all connected now through this shared understanding. What we discovered through our journey was not just a solution to our fertility struggles, but a deeper truth about human connection. The condition in the Mitchell bloodline that prevented me from conceiving wasn't a curse or a failure. It was simply a biological reality that required understanding and adaptation. Once we embraced the full truth of Thomas's heritage, once we stopped denying parts of his family's story, the path forward became clear. Sarah lifted Ava higher in her arms, the infant blinking calmly at the crowd. This child represents more than just our personal triumph over infertility. She represents the healing of division, the acknowledgement of truth, and the power of bringing different forms of wisdom together. Her very existence proves that what appears impossible becomes possible when we honor all parts of who we are. As the gathering dispersed into a celebration featuring food, music, and stories from both cultural traditions, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of Whispering Pine Creek with Nora, watching the water flow over ancient stones. "My grandmother would be proud," Nora said, her gaze on the mingling families. Not just of the healing work continuing, but of the barriers being broken down. Sarah nodded, thinking of all that had changed in a single year. From isolation to community, from shame to pride, from Barren to mother. "The creek keeps flowing," she observed, "no matter what human dramas play out on its banks." "Yes," Nora agreed with a small smile. "And like the water, truth always finds its way forward, even through the hardest obstacles. It just takes time, and sometimes a little help to clear the path." As Thomas approached Ava, his face alight with the simple joy of fatherhood, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. The journey that had begun in pain and isolation had led to this moment of connection and wholeness, not just for her, but for an entire community ready to acknowledge the complex truths of their shared history. Ava reached out her tiny hand, grasping at the sunlight filtering through the trees. A perfect symbol, Sarah thought, of reaching for truth, of embracing light, of connecting what once seemed impossibly divided. Her daughter would grow up knowing all parts of her story, carrying forward not just genetic heritage, but the wisdom, hard-won through generations of struggle and finally acceptance. 5 years passed, each season bringing new growth and deeper understanding to the families united by little Ava's birth. Willowbrook itself had transformed, evolving from a town that buried uncomfortable truths to a community that actively celebrated its diverse heritage. On a warm September afternoon, Sarah stood on the wide porch of the Mitchell ranch house. Now, her and Thomas's home, since Richard and Eleanor had decided to move into a smaller house in town. She watched her daughter chase butterflies across the lawn, Ava's dark braids flying behind her as she ran with the boundless energy of childhood. "Careful, near the flower beds," Sarah called, smiling as Ava skidded to a halt just before trampling Eleanor's prized roses. At 5, Ava was a perfect blend of her parents, Thomas's determined chin and Sarah's inquisitive eyes, with a spirit entirely her own. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Dr. Harrison's car. He emerged with a portfolio tucked under his arm, his face alight with professional excitement. "They've accepted the research paper," he announced without preamble as he climbed the porch steps. "The New England Journal of Medicine wants to publish our findings on the Mitchell immune compatibility syndrome." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's wonderful news, Alan. After all these years of data collection and case studies, it wouldn't have been possible without you and Thomas," Dr. Harrison said, taking the seat she offered, "or without Nora's willingness to share her family's traditional knowledge." Their collaboration had grown from treating one couple's infertility into a groundbreaking research project documenting similar cases across the country. The condition they had identified, officially named Mitchell-Blackhawk Immune Compatibility Syndrome in the paper, had been found in several other families, with similar historical patterns. The review committee was particularly impressed with the way we integrated traditional medicinal knowledge with modern immunology, Dr. Harrison continued, opening his portfolio to show Sarah the acceptance letter. "They're calling it a model for future research into indigenous healing practices." Sarah felt a surge of pride as she scanned the document. What had begun as her personal struggle had evolved into something that would help countless other couples face similar challenges. "Have you told Nora yet?" she asked. "She's my next stop," Dr. Harrison replied. "Though I suspect she already knows somehow. She called me this morning to say she had good news coming." Sarah laughed. "That sounds like Nora. Her intuition still amazes me after all these years." As if summoned by their conversation, a truck appeared at the end of the long driveway, Richard's vehicle, returning from town with Eleanor and Nora, who had been meeting with the Historical Society. Ava spotted her grandparents and raced toward the approaching truck, her earlier butterfly chase forgotten. "They're expanding the exhibit," Eleanor announced as they joined Sarah and Dr. Harrison on the porch. "The Willowbrook Heritage Center wants to dedicate an entire wing to indigenous medical practices featuring the Mitchell-Blackhawk research." The Historical Society's transformation had been one of the most surprising developments of the past 5 years. Under Eleanor's unexpected leadership, it had evolved from an organization dedicated to preserving a sanitized version of the town's history to one committed to documenting the full complexity of its development, including the contributions of Native American communities that had been previously minimized. "The timing is perfect," Dr. Harrison said, sharing his news about the journal acceptance. "The publication will bring national attention to our research." Nora nodded, her silver braids gleaming in the afternoon sun. At 82, she remained remarkably vital, though she had begun training several younger community members in her healing practices to ensure the knowledge continued. "Knowledge that heals should never be hidden," she said simply, My grandmother would be pleased to see her work recognized by the medical establishment she once feared. Thomas emerged from the barn, where he'd been on a call with the ranch's accountant. At 39, with streaks of silver beginning to appear at his temples, he had grown into his role as both ranch manager and advocate for medical research that bridged cultural divides. "What's all the excitement about?" he asked, swinging Ava up onto his shoulders as she ran to him. As the adults shared the news, Sarah watched her husband's face, still moved by the way he had embraced their journey from the moment he'd overcome. His initial skepticism, his commitment to understanding his family's unique heritage, had never wavered, even when it meant challenging deep-seated beliefs. "We should celebrate," Thomas declared. "A family dinner tonight, all of us together. And Jason and Laura," Sarah added. "They were so instrumental in finding William's letters. And Dr. Morris from the University Genetics Lab," Dr. Harrison suggested. "She's been essential to the research." Eleanor, who had once guarded the Mitchell family gatherings as exclusive events, now nodded enthusiastically. "I'll call everyone. We can set up tables on the lawn if the weather holds." As preparations for the impromptu celebration began, Sarah found a quiet moment with Thomas on the far side of the porch, away from the cheerful commotion. "Did you ever imagine this is where we'd end up?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. "When we were in those dark days, thinking we'd never have a family." Thomas's arm tightened around her. "Never. I thought we were facing a personal tragedy. I never saw that we were actually on the edge of a discovery that would change so many lives." Sarah watched Ava, helping Eleanor arrange flowers for the dinner tables, the two of them completely comfortable in their bond, despite the painful history that had preceded it. "There's something I haven't told you yet," she said softly. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." Thomas looked down at her, a question in his eyes. "I'm pregnant," Sarah revealed, joy bubbling through her voice. "About 8 weeks along. I confirmed it with a blood test yesterday." Thomas stared at her in wonder, before breaking into a radiant smile. "Without the treatment this time? Dr. Harrison thought that might be possible, that your body might maintain the immune adaptation." "After Ava?" Sarah nodded. "It seems to have worked exactly as Nora predicted. The first treatment created a lasting change in my immune response to your particular biology." Thomas pulled her into a tight embrace, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Another miracle," he whispered against her hair. "A sibling for Ava." "Speaking of Ava," Sarah murmured, "we should tell her first, before the celebration tonight." They called their daughter over, watching her race across the lawn with the boundless energy that constantly amazed them. As they shared their news, Ava's eyes widened with excitement. "A baby brother or sister," she exclaimed. "When? How long do I have to wait?" "About 7 more months," Sarah explained, laughing at her daughter's impatience. "The baby needs time to grow, just like you did." Ava considered this seriously. "Will the baby have the special Mitchell blood that Nora talks about? The one that made it hard for you to have me?" Sarah and Thomas exchanged surprised glances. They had always been honest with Ava about her heritage and the journey to her birth, but they hadn't realized how much she had absorbed from overheard conversations. "Yes," Thomas answered carefully. "The baby will have the same special blood as me and you, but it won't cause the same difficulties because your mother's body has learned how to work with it now." Ava nodded, satisfied with this explanation. "Can I tell everyone at the party tonight? I want to make an announcement like grown-ups do." "Of course," Sarah agreed, touched by her daughter's enthusiasm. "It's your news too, after all." As twilight descended, the ranch's lawn transformed into a celebration space. Lanterns hung from tree branches, casting warm light over tables draped with colorful clothes. The guests arrived in waves. The Blackhawk family members, Dr. Harrison and his research colleagues, Jason and Laura Cooper, community members who had supported their journey, and even a journalist from the regional newspaper who was covering the medical journal publication. When everyone had gathered, glasses filled with sparkling cider for a toast, Ava surprised them all by climbing onto a chair and calling for attention, with the confident voice of a child accustomed to being heard and valued. "I have an important announcement," she declared, her eyes bright with excitement. "My mommy and daddy are having another baby. I'm going to be a big sister." The news was met with cheers and congratulations, the celebration taking on an even more joyful atmosphere. As Sarah accepted hugs and well wishes, she found herself next to Nora, who smiled knowingly. "You knew, didn't you?" Sarah asked. "Even before I told anyone." "I suspected," Nora admitted. "There's a certain glow about you that I recognized, and the timing is auspicious, a new life beginning as our work reaches a wider audience." Dr. Morris, the university geneticist, joined their conversation. "This second pregnancy will be invaluable to our research," she said, her scientific excitement barely contained. "It confirms the lasting immune adaptation theory we proposed. In the paper, my child is not a research subject," Sarah reminded her gently. Dr. Morris flushed. "Of course not. I apologize for my enthusiasm overriding my sensitivity. It's just, this work is so groundbreaking." "It is," Sarah agreed, "but it's also deeply personal for many families. That's something we can never forget in the research. These are real lives, real hopes and dreams we're dealing with." As dinner progressed under the stars, the conversation flowed from scientific discoveries to personal stories. Several couples who had benefited from the Mitchell Blackhawk treatment shared their experiences, each tale adding to the tapestry of understanding they were collectively weaving. Later in the evening, Richard Mitchell tapped his glass for attention. The former patriarch of the Mitchell Ranch had aged visibly in recent years, his once commanding presence softened by time and perspective. "I'd like to say something," he began, his voice steady despite his evident emotion. "When my father told me about our family's unique condition, he presented it as something to be hidden, protected, a secret that preserved our status in this community." Richard looked around the diverse gathering, native and non-native, scientific and traditional, young and old, all united by a shared pursuit of understanding. If he could see us tonight, I think he would finally understand what he wrote in those letters to Ava Blackhawk. Our strength was never in isolation or purity. It was always in connection, in the blending of different worlds and wisdoms. He raised his glass, to connect, to tell the truth, and to the next generation that will carry this understanding forward. The toast echoed around the tables, voices joining in celebration of how far they had come from the days when Sarah had stood, alone in her kitchen, bearing the weight of being called Barren. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah found herself walking with Thomas toward Whispering Pine Creek, which marked the boundary of the ranch property, the same creek where William and Ava had once met in secret, where generations of both families had come to reflect and connect with the land. The water glimmered in the moonlight, its surface rippled by a gentle breeze. In the distance, the lights of the celebration continued to glow, voices carrying faintly in the night air. "I was thinking," Thomas said as they stood side by side, watching the flowing water, "about names for the baby." Sarah smiled, her hand resting on her still flat abdomen. "Already, we have 7 months to decide. If it's a boy," Thomas continued, "what would you think about William? Not for my grandfather directly, but for what his story taught us, about the cost of secrets and the importance of honoring all parts of who we are." Sarah considered this, remembering the letters they had read, the journey of a man who had chosen family expectation over love, but had eventually recognized the truth. "William, if it's a boy," she agreed, "and if it's a girl." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "What about Hope?" Not for any family connection, but for what our story represents. For all the couples who felt hopeless until they found answers in our research. William or Hope, Sarah said, testing the names in the night air. Perfect either way. As they turned back toward the lights of the celebration, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From being labeled as lacking, barren, she had become part of creating something abundant. Not just a family of her own, but a bridge between medical traditions, a healing of historical wounds, and hope for couples facing similar struggles. The child growing within her would never know the isolation and shame she had once endured. This child would be born into a community that understood and celebrated the complex heritage that had once been hidden. A community transformed by the courage to question established narratives and seek deeper truths. The next morning, Sarah woke early and slipped out of bed, leaving Thomas still peacefully asleep. She found Ava already awake, sitting cross-legged on the porch swing, an unusual stillness to her normally boundless energy. "Good morning, Butterfly," Sarah said, using her pet name for her daughter. "You're up early." Ava patted the seat beside her. "I was thinking about the baby," she explained seriously as Sarah joined her, "and about the story of how I was born." "What about it?" Sarah asked, intrigued by her daughter's contemplative mood. "Nora says I'm special because I'm the first Mitchell baby in generations who was born because people told the truth instead of hiding it," Ava said. "Is that right?" Sarah marveled at the child's grasp of their complex family history. "Yes, that's right. Finding the truth about your daddy's family history helped us figure out how to have you." Ava nodded, processing this. "And now lots of other families can have babies too, because of what you learned." "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "Dr. Harrison and Nora have helped many couples who had the same problem we did." "Then I'm glad you didn't give up," Ava said decisively, "even when Grandma Eleanor was mean to you." Sarah suppressed a smile at this characterization of the past. Grandma Eleanor wasn't trying to be mean, she just didn't understand what was happening. But now she does, and look how much she loves you. Ava considered this, swinging her legs thoughtfully. "People should always tell the truth," she declared, "even when it's hard." "That's a good way to live," Sarah agreed, pulling her daughter close. "The truth isn't always easy, but it's how we find our way forward." As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the ranch, Sarah reflected on the wisdom of her 5-year-old. From being cast out and labeled as lacking, she had found her way to this moment of peace and understanding, not by accepting others' definitions of her worth, but by pursuing truth even when it led her down unexpected paths. The journey from barrenness to abundance had not been one of physical change alone, but of shifting perceptions, challenging assumptions, and recognizing that healing often requires bringing hidden things to light. Whatever the future held, for her growing family, for the research that now bore their name, for the community that had been transformed alongside them, Sarah knew they would face it with the same commitment to truth and connection that had brought them this far. The creek continued to flow at the edge of the property, as it had for centuries before the Mitchells or the Blackhawks had claimed this land. Like the water finding its inevitable path to the sea, truth had a way of emerging, no matter how many obstacles were placed in its path. Sarah had learned to trust that flow, to recognize that some forces could be temporarily diverted but never permanently damned. She was no longer barren, not in body, not in spirit, not in community. Instead, she had become a vessel for a different kind of creation, the bringing together of separate worlds, the healing of ancient wounds, the forging of new possibilities from the broken pieces of the past. 15 years later, the Mitchell Ranch stood as a testament to evolution and growth. The old Victorian house had been expanded to accommodate not just family, but also the research center that now occupied the converted barn. What had begun as a personal journey had blossomed into the Mitchell Blackhawk Center for Integrative Medicine, a place where traditional healing practices and modern medical science worked in harmony. Sarah, now in her early 50s, stood at the entrance of the center, welcoming participants to the annual symposium that brought healthcare practitioners from across the country to learn about immune compatibility issues and indigenous treatment approaches. Her hair showed elegant streaks of silver, and the confidence in her posture reflected a woman who had found her purpose. "Dr. Mitchell, they're ready for you in the main hall," her assistant informed her, still using the title that had come with Sarah's PhD in integrative medicine, earned 10 years earlier. As Sarah made her way through the facility, she passed walls lined with framed photographs documenting the center's history, the groundbreaking ceremony with Eleanor cutting the ribbon, Nora teaching a group of medical students about plant-based treatments, Thomas and their children planting the medicinal garden that now occupied an acre behind the center. In the main lecture hall, over 100 healthcare professionals waited for the keynote address. Sarah took her place at the podium, gazing out at the diverse audience, doctors, nurses, researchers, and traditional healers from various indigenous communities. 20 years ago, she began, I stood in my kitchen, carrying the weight of being labeled Barren by a family and community that didn't understand the real cause of my inability to conceive. The room grew quiet, many having heard pieces of her story, but few knowing its entirety. That personal struggle led to a discovery that has since helped thousands of couples facing similar challenges. But more importantly, it revealed something profound about healing itself. The true medicine doesn't exist in isolated traditions, but in the courage to bridge different worlds of knowledge. As Sarah continued her address, 20-year-old Ava Mitchell slipped into the back of the hall, having arrived directly from her college campus 3 hours away. Now a pre-med student focusing on reproductive immunology, she carried both her parents' determination and the unique perspective of someone who owed her existence to the bridging of medical traditions. Beside her stood her 15-year-old brother, William, tall and thoughtful, with their father's strong features and their mother's compassionate eyes. Although too young to fully grasp the scientific aspects of the symposium, he had insisted on attending to support his mother and sister. The Mitchell-Blackhawk syndrome, as it's now known in medical literature, affects approximately 1 in 10,000 couples, Sarah was explaining to the audience. But its significance extends far beyond reproductive medicine. It has become a model for how indigenous knowledge and Western science can collaborate to solve problems that neither tradition could address alone. From her seat in the front row, Eleanor Mitchell watched her daughter-in-law with undisguised pride. At 85, she had outlived her husband Richard by 3 years, channeling her grief into even more dedicated work at the center. The woman who had once defined herself by rigid social hierarchies now spent her days documenting oral histories from tribal elders about their healing practices. As Sarah concluded her speech to enthusiastic applause, she noticed Ava and William at the back of the room, her face lit up with surprise and joy, not having expected her daughter until the following day. The audience turned to see what had caught the speaker's attention, many smiling at this visible reminder of the personal story behind the scientific presentation. The symposium's morning session gave way to afternoon workshops, with participants breaking into smaller groups to learn specific techniques. Sarah finally found a moment to embrace her children in the center's garden, where Nora Blackhawk's grandniece Lisa was leading a session on medicinal plant identification. I thought. You had exams, Sarah said, hugging Ava tightly. I did, Ava confirmed. Finished early and drove straight here. I wouldn't miss your keynote, Mom. Besides, Professor Jackson is presenting tomorrow, and I need to talk to her about my research proposal. William, less academically driven than his sister, but equally thoughtful, was examining the plant samples with careful attention. His dad still at the genetics lab, he asked. "He'll be back for dinner," Sarah assured him. "He's meeting with researchers from the NIH about extending the study to other familial compatibility issues." The Mitchell family's evening gathering took place on the wide porch of the main house, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing extended family. Thomas returned just as the sun began to set, bringing with him Dr. Harrison, now retired from medical practice but still actively involved in the center's research. "The NIH is committing to another 5 years of funding," Thomas announced as he joined them. "They're particularly interested in applying our findings to organ transplantation rejection issues." Sarah smiled at her husband, still moved by his dedication to the work that had begun with their personal struggle. Though his primary responsibilities remained with the ranch operations, Thomas had become an eloquent advocate for integrative medicine, his business acumen helping to secure the resources needed for the center's expansion. "Nora would be proud," Dr. Harrison commented, raising his glass in a toast. "She always said the knowledge was meant to heal beyond just childbearing." Nora Blackhawk had passed away peacefully 3 winters earlier, at the age of 94. Her final years had been dedicated to ensuring her family's healing traditions were properly documented and shared. The center now included a library named in her honor, where her journals and recordings were preserved alongside scientific publications that validated many of her approaches. As twilight deepened into evening, the conversation around the dinner table flowed easily between personal updates and professional developments. Ava shared her excitement about a new research direction she was pursuing in college, looking at applications of the Mitchell-Blackhawk principles to autoimmune disorders. "It's not just about conception," she explained animatedly. "The same immune mechanisms that caused Mom's body to reject Dad's genetic material could help explain why some bodies attack themselves in autoimmune conditions." William, though less scientifically inclined than his sister, listened with genuine interest. His own passions leaned toward environmental conservation and sustainable ranching practices, areas in which he had begun to make his mark on the family business. "Different paths, same values," Thomas observed quietly to Sarah as they watched their children debate a technical point with Dr. Harrison. "They both understand the importance of bridging different worlds." After dinner, as the guests departed, and the family settled into a comfortable routine, Sarah found herself drawn to the creek that still marked the property's boundary, the same creek where William Mitchell and Ava Blackhawk had once met in secret, where Sarah had first begun to process Nora's revelations about the Mitchell bloodline, where over the years she had come to reflect on the journey from isolation to community. The water still flowed as it always had, carrying the same ancient wisdom. Sarah sat on a flat rock at the water's edge, listening to its gentle music. So much had changed in 20 years, yet the fundamental truth remained. Healing came from connection, not division, from embracing complexity rather than seeking simple. Blame, from the label of Barren, a word meant to diminish and exclude, had grown this abundant life, this center of learning and healing, this family that bridged worlds once thought incompatible. The journey had not been easy, but standing now in the fullness of what had been created, Sarah couldn't imagine having taken any other path. As she walked back toward the lights of home, Sarah reflected on how personal pain, when met with courage and openness, could transform into something that served far beyond oneself. The Mitchell-Blackhawk Center would continue its work long after she was gone, helping couples who might otherwise have carried the same burden of unexplained infertility she had once borne alone. But perhaps more importantly, it stood as a living testament to the power of truth-telling, of bringing hidden things to light, of challenging comfortable narratives, of honoring all the streams that flow into the river of human experience. In a world still too often divided by arbitrary boundaries of tradition, culture, and belief, It offered a model of integration and respect that transcended its specific medical focus. The center, like the family that had created it, had become a place where nothing and no one was considered barren, where every tradition contained seeds of wisdom, where every person's experience could contribute to collective understanding, where healing flowed not from separation, but from the courage to connect across differences. And in that, Sarah knew, lay their most profound legacy. 25 years had passed since Sarah first stood at her kitchen window, bearing the weight of being called Barren. The small ranch house where she and Thomas had begun their marriage had long since been sold, replaced by a sprawling family compound that housed not only their immediate family, but also the internationally recognized Mitchell Black Hawk Institute for Reproductive Immunology. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood at the window of her office, watching golden leaves drift from the ancient oak trees that lined the Institute's main pathway. At 57, her face had gained the character. Lines of a life fully lived, her once auburn hair now a distinguished silver. Her eyes, however, retained the same determined spark that had driven her to question medical assumptions and family narratives a quarter-century earlier. "Mom!" Ava's voice came from the doorway. At 30, she had grown into a remarkable combination of her parents. Thomas's height and strong features softened by Sarah's expressive eyes and gentle manner. Her credentials as Dr. Ava Mitchell, Ph.D., M.D., had recently been added to the Institute's leadership board. "The Senate committee is ready for your testimony," Ava continued. "The video conference link is set up in the main conference room." Sarah nodded, gathering the materials she had prepared for her virtual appearance before the Senate Health Committee. Today's hearing on the integration of traditional healing practices into modern healthcare had been years in the making, representing a potential turning point in national health policy. "Is your brother joining us?" Sarah asked as they walked through the Institute's main building, where researchers from diverse backgrounds, medical doctors, traditional healers, immunologists and ethnobotanists collaborated on projects that bridged scientific disciplines and cultural traditions. "William's on his way," Ava confirmed. "He's bringing Lena and the baby." The mention of her 5-month-old granddaughter brought an immediate smile to Sarah's face. Little Nora, named for the Comanche healer who had changed the course of their family history, represented the continuation of their legacy in more ways than one. In the conference room, Thomas was already seated alongside Dr. Alan Harrison, now in his 80s but still sharp-minded and passionate about their work. Eleanor Mitchell had passed away peacefully 3 years earlier at the age of 97, having lived to see the institute she had once opposed become a globally respected center for integrative medicine. The committee chairman just sent over some additional questions, Thomas informed Sarah, passing her a tablet. At 62, he had retained his rancher's sturdy build, though years of academic collaboration had added a scholarly demeanor to his once purely practical presence. They're particularly interested in the economic impact of integrating traditional practices into mainstream healthcare systems. Sarah scanned the questions, making mental notes of points to emphasize. The journey from personal medical mystery to national healthcare policy had been long and often challenging, but each step had built upon the last, creating a path where none had existed before. William arrived with his wife Lena, a Kiowa physician whose own family's traditional healing knowledge had contributed significantly to the Institute's research. Baby Nora, round-cheeked and curious, immediately reached for her grandmother as they entered. "Perfect timing," Sarah said, taking the infant while William and Lena settled into seats around the conference table. "She can watch her grandmother. Make history." The video conference began with formal introductions, the senators appearing in a grid of screens on the wall display. Senator Claire Martinez, the committee chair, greeted Sarah with evident respect. "Dr. Mitchell, thank you for appearing before this committee. Your institute's research on immune compatibility issues has revolutionized our understanding of unexplained infertility and transplant rejection. Today, we're interested in your perspective on how traditional healing practices might be more broadly integrated into our healthcare system. Sarah adjusted the baby on her lap and leaned toward the camera. Thank you, Senator Martinez. 25 years ago, I was a nurse struggling with unexplained infertility. Modern medicine offered no solutions because it wasn't asking the right questions. It was a Comanche healer named Nora Blackhawk who identified the immune compatibility issue affecting my husband's family, a condition that has since been documented in thousands of couples across multiple ethnic backgrounds. She paused, looking down briefly at her granddaughter. What began as a personal medical mystery evolved into a research question, then into a documented syndrome, and eventually into a model for how different healing traditions can complement each other. The Mitchell-Blackhawk Protocol for Immune Compatibility has helped over 8,000 couples conceive children who might otherwise have remained childless. And beyond reproductive medicine, prompted Senator Jackson, an advocate for healthcare reform, the principles we identified have applications far beyond fertility, Sarah explained. Our work with organ transplantation has increased compatibility, matching accuracy by 38%. Our immune modulation protocols, derived from traditional plant-based medicines, have reduced rejection rates in high-risk transplant cases by nearly half. For the next hour, Sarah fielded questions about research methodologies, clinical outcomes, economic impacts, and training programs. She explained how the Institute had created certification paths for traditional healers that honored their knowledge, while establishing standards that allowed for integration with conventional healthcare systems. The key insight of our work isn't just about specific treatments, Sarah emphasized toward the end of her testimony. It's about recognizing that medical knowledge doesn't belong exclusively to any one tradition. When we created protocols that respected both indigenous wisdom and scientific methodology, we discovered solutions that neither approach could have achieved alone. As the hearing concluded, Senator Martinez thanked Sarah for her testimony. Your institute's work represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking our healthcare system needs. We'll be taking your recommendations under serious consideration as we develop this legislation. After the video conference ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by her family, Thomas, Ava, William, Lena, and baby Nora, all of whom had remained quietly supportive throughout the testimony. "You did it, Mom," Ava said, squeezing her mother's hand. "Years of work, and they really heard you. We did it," Sarah corrected, looking around at the family that had grown from struggle and transformation. All of us, including those who aren't here to see it. Later that afternoon, as the Institute staff celebrated the successful testimony with a small gathering in the central courtyard, Sarah slipped away for a private moment. She made her way to a secluded garden at the eastern edge of the property, where a simple stone monument stood beneath a spreading cottonwood tree. The monument, erected 5 years earlier, bore the names of those whose wisdom and courage had made their work possible: Nora Blackhawk, William Mitchell, Ava Blackhawk, Catherine Walker Mitchell, and Eleanor Jenkins Mitchell. Beneath the names was inscribed, "Truth flows like water, finding its path despite obstacles, nurturing life along its journey." Sarah placed her hand on the warm stone, feeling connected to the complex lineage that had shaped her life's work. She had come to understand that Barren was never truly about the inability to conceive a child. It was a state of isolation, of disconnection, of knowledge fragmented and wisdom lost. True fertility lay in connection, in the courage to cross boundaries, in the willingness to question stories that divided rather than united. "I thought I might find you here," came Thomas's voice behind her. "The senator's aides just called. They want you to consult directly on drafting the integration guidelines for the legislation." Sarah turned to her husband, taking his offered hand. "That's faster than I expected. Usually these things move at glacial pace." "Not when the evidence is as compelling as what we've documented," Thomas replied. 25 years of clinical outcomes are hard to dismiss." They stood together in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun filtering through the cottonwood's leaves, creating dappled patterns on the monument. "Do you ever think about where we'd be if you hadn't met Nora that day at the Founders' Day?" "A celebration?" Thomas asked quietly. "If you hadn't been brave enough to question what everyone, including me, had accepted as truth." Sarah considered this counterfactual history, a timeline in which she had continued to bear the label of Barren without challenging its validity, in which the Mitchell family secret had remained buried for another generation, in which the healing connection between different traditions had never been forged. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "but what I've come to believe is that truth has its own momentum. If not me, someone else would eventually have asked the right questions. The real miracle was having people on both sides willing to bridge the divide. Nora with her scientific curiosity, your father with his quiet knowledge, you with your willingness to reconsider everything you'd been taught about your family." Thomas nodded, his eyes on the monument. "Do you remember what my grandfather wrote in those letters to Ava Blackhawk? About how our true strength was never in isolation, but in connection." "I think about that line often," Sarah said. "It applies to so much more than just our family history." Their reflective moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. William, carrying baby Nora, with Lena and Ava following close behind. "Sorry to disturb you," William said, "but someone was very insistent on seeing her grandparents." Baby Nora reached out pudgy hands toward Sarah, who took her with practiced ease. The infant immediately grabbed for the pendant Sarah wore, a small gold watch that had once belonged to William Mitchell, given to Ava Blackhawk, and later passed to Sarah as a symbol of connections that transcended time and division. "She's always drawn to shiny objects," Lena observed with a smile. "Not just shiny," Sarah replied, watching the baby's fascination. "This one has a story attached to it. Someday, when she's older, I'll tell her how this watch connects her to people who never got to meet her, but whose choices made her existence possible." As they walked back toward the Institute buildings, where the celebration continued, Sarah found herself reflecting on the circular nature of their journey. What had begun with her alone in a kitchen, bearing the shame of being labeled barren, had expanded outward in ever-widening circles, first to her marriage, then to the extended family, then to their community, and now to national policy that would affect millions of lives. Yet at the center of those circles remained the simple, powerful truth that had started everything. Healing could not happen in isolation. Not for individuals, not for families, not for medical traditions, not for cultures. True fertility, the ability to create, to grow, to bring forth new life in all its forms, required connection across differences that might seem at first glance incompatible. The Institute's main building came into view, its modern architecture intentionally incorporating elements from both the Mitchell Ranch House and traditional Comanche design. Solar panels gleamed on the roof alongside a garden of medicinal plants arranged according to centuries-old indigenous knowledge. Inside those walls, researchers from diverse backgrounds and traditions worked together, not by erasing their differences, but by honoring the unique perspective each brought to their shared questions. As they rejoined the celebration, Sarah handed baby Nora to Thomas and accepted a glass of champagne from Dr. Harrison, who had become like family over their decades of collaboration. "To your successful testimony," he said, raising his glass, "and to how far we've come from that first conversation about mysterious Mitchell genetics." Sarah smiled, remembering the skeptical doctor who had eventually become one of their strongest allies in bridging traditional and conventional medicine. To asking the right questions, she countered, even when the answers challenge everything we think we know. As evening approached, the gathering began to disperse, researchers and staff returning to homes or nearby accommodations. The family moved to the main house for dinner, a regular ritual that grounded their increasingly public work in the private bonds of love and shared history. Seated at the head of the long dining table, Sarah looked at the faces gathered around her. Thomas, her partner in transformation. Ava, now carrying forward their research with brilliant new insights. William and Lena, blending ranching traditions with healing practices in ways that honored both. And baby Nora, representing possibilities not yet imagined. "I got a call from a reporter today," Ava mentioned as they passed dishes around the table. She wanted to do a feature story on how the Barren woman cast out by her husband's family became a leading voice in integrative medicine. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell her?" "I said she had the story backward," Ava replied with a smile. "That it wasn't about being cast out at all. It was about finding your way in, about creating connections where there were only barriers." Thomas reached for Sarah's hand across the table. "Well said." As darkness fell outside the windows, Sarah felt the weight of the day's significance settle around her. From kitchen window to Senate testimony, from isolation to community, from barren to abundantly fertile in ways that transcended the merely biological. The journey had required courage at every turn, the willingness to question, to seek, to connect rather than divide. The label that had once defined her had been transformed into its opposite, not through denial or avoidance, but through diving deeper into its meaning, questioning its premises, and ultimately redefining fertility itself as something far broader than the ability to conceive a child. Later, after dinner was cleared and goodbyes said, Sarah and Thomas walked together to the creek that still marked the property's boundary. The same creek where William Mitchell and Ava Blackhawk had once met, where their story had begun decades before Sarah ever entered it. The water still flowed as it always had, constant yet ever-changing, carrying ancient wisdom forward into new configurations. Sarah had come to see their work in similar terms, not creating something entirely new, but rather allowing knowledge to flow in its natural patterns, removing the artificial dams that had diverted its course and trusting in its inherent wisdom. "Full circle," Thomas murmured, seeming to follow her thoughts. "Not a circle," Sarah corrected gently. "A spiral. We return to similar points, but always at a different level. What was pain becomes purpose. What was division becomes connection. What was barren becomes fertile ground for something larger than ourselves." The creek continued its eternal journey, carrying their words downstream toward a future they would help to shape but not fully see. A future where the false boundaries between healing traditions might finally dissolve, where old stories of separation gave way to new narratives of connection, where the labels used to diminish and divide were transformed into bridges of understanding. And in that flowing, ever-changing constancy, Sarah found the perfect metaphor for the journey that had brought her from barrenness to abundance, not by denying the challenges she had faced, but by moving through them toward deeper truths that connected rather than separated, that healed rather than harmed, that created rather than destroyed. Truth, like water, would always find its path. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.